Welcome to note set number 3, which is our notes on shapes. So this is a third topic that feels very separate from the first two topics. But like I said, the first two videos, eventually they'll all combine together. So this is number 3. And we start getting into a lot of vocabulary words. If you struggle with vocabulary, it really helps to make flashcards or to look up at the ceiling and write out and spell the word and then say its definition. Those are some tricks to help you memorize. So the first vocabulary word is congruent, and congruent just means the same. So if I say two people have congruent heights, it means they're the same height. If I say two sides have congruent lengths, it means they're the same length. So congruent is the big word to mean the same. So when we have a shape, there's a bunch of ways to label shapes, to explain their rules, basically. So at the right, you can see an isosceles trapezoid, and it's all marked up and all labeled in weird ways. And I'll explain what that means. But basically, if you have a single point, it's a hard dot with a little letter by it. So like this is a point, point D, point A, point B, and point C. So the letter itself is the point. So if I wanted to say a line, like this line right here, how you say it is you start with the point that it starts with, A, and it ends at B. So you say AB, and then you put a little line above it to say line AB. Now if I have two lines that are completely congruent, so if they're congruent lines, what you end up doing with them is you put a tick mark through them. So you put a tick, okay, which kind of looks like that. So as you can see in this picture, this line is congruent to this line. Meaning if this line was 3 inches, this line is also 3 inches. They have the same length. So that little tick mark means they're congruent. However, if they're parallel, remember the word parallel means they never ever cross. It's like you have two lines going the same direction and they never cross each other. But if they're like this, they'd eventually cross. So those aren't parallel. But two lines that never cross are parallel lines. And for parallel lines, we put arrows that kind of look like that. Okay? So you can see here, these two are not parallel, the two congruent lines, because eventually they'd cross and hit each other. But this one, AB and DC, the top and bottom lines, do run straight in a way that they'll never cross each other. So this arrow with this arrow means that they're parallel lines. Okay? Now when we have an angle in a picture, remember an angle is where two lines cross and it's how far apart they are. So an angle in a picture, we mark with this little symbol. It's kind of like a half circle. We mark a half circle when it's an angle. When the angles are congruent, we keep the half circles, but we end up putting tick marks through them. So it's a half circle with a tick. And so if you look at this angle right here, it's a half circle with one tick. This one is also a half circle with one tick. So angle D and C are congruent to each other right now. So if this is 20 degrees, then that one's 20 degrees. However, angle A and B have 2 ticks each, which means they're also congruent to each other. So you put 2 ticks there to say they're congruent, but they're not the same as those two. So those two are the same, and those two are the same. So here's one pair 1, so they get 1 tick. And then A and B is pair 2, so they get 2 ticks. So we have 2 different pairs of congruent lines. Remember the word pair means there's 2 of them? And I meant 2 different pairs of congruent angles. So we have 2 different pairs of congruent angles. Pair 1 and pair 2. And remember the word pair means two of them, which means there's a total of 4 angles, but there are 2 different pairs. And finally, 90 degrees is when a line perfectly goes up and down and perfectly goes left and right with no tilt at all. And so it makes a perfect little square box, almost like you could put a little box in it. And it's like a little square, it can go perfectly in there. And that's 90 degrees. And so we mark it with a little box like that. And we put the little box in there. So for each shape, we're going to go through and label them, and we're going to describe them with all of these. So when you describe a shape, I'm just going to sort of write it right here. You list the name, how many sides it has, if it has congruent lines, if it has parallel lines, and if it has congruent angles. Okay? So these 16 shapes in this packet, you're expected to know. You're expected to know their definitions, meaning how they're marked up, and you're expected to memorize that. And these are the 16 main shapes that we're going to end up using. So this is the isosceles trapezoid. So I'm going to re-copy down my tick marks, and I'm going to actually color code them. So anything congruent, so I'm going to make yellow. So this was congruent, this was congruent. This is congruent with this guy, so they each get 1. This one's congruent with this one, so they're each going to get 2. And then I'm going to go back over this in pencil so that you can see it. And then this line right here is parallel with this one, because I'll never cross. So they get little arrows, and I'm going to mark them in blue. Okay? So if I'm writing this out, and at first I gave you the names, but not always, so you're going to have to rewrite them. But an isosceles trapezoid, that's what this is. And so we did name. How many sides? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 sides. Do we have any congruent lines? Well, this one is the same as this one, because that's the tick mark. And their sides are like the edges. And so that's 1 pair. Because there's 2 of them, but they're congruent to each other. And so it's 1 pair of congruent lines. Next is parallel lines, and we do have 1 set of parallel. So 1 pair of parallel lines. And then next is congruent angles. Well, here's a pair, because these both have 1 tick through them. And here's another pair, because these both have 2 ticks through them. So I have 2 pairs of congruent angles. Okay? The next shape's a square. So a square has all 4 angles are 90 degrees. The interesting part about a square is that all 4 sides are the same. So if this side's 3, this side's 3, that side's 3, and that side's 3. They're all the same. Okay? And then for parallel, the top and bottom will never cross each other. So I'm going to give them both 1 arrow. 1 arrow each, and I'm going to make my parallel lines blue. But then also the left and right side run parallel. But they're not parallel to these 2, so they're going to get 2 arrows to say they're different. They're parallel to each other, but not parallel to the 1 arrow ones. 2 arrows, 2 arrows. So if I'm describing the shape, it has 4 sides. Because the name's already written there, a square is 4 sides. For congruent lines, all 4 of them are congruent to each other. So all 4 lines are congruent. Next is parallel lines. Well, top and bottom's 1 pair, and left and right are another pair. So I have 2 pairs of parallel lines. And then for the angles, we marked that they were all 90 degrees, which means all 4 angles are the same, so they're also congruent. So all 4 angles are congruent, and they're the special one, the 90-degree one, and 90 degrees. So the next shape's a rectangle. A rectangle has 4 90-degree angles in it, like the square. And a rectangle, the left and right are congruent, but they're different than the top and bottom being congruent. So I'm going to give these ones 2 tick marks each to say it's a different set of congruent. Now for parallel, the top and bottom will never cross, so I'm going to give them each 1 arrow. Never cross. And the left and right will never cross, but it's different than the other 2, so I'm going to give them 2 arrows. 2 arrows. So when I describe my shape, for the rest of them you have to write the name. So a rectangle is, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. Congruent lines, these 2 were congruent and those 2 were congruent. So it's 2 pairs of congruent lines. For parallel lines, these 2 are parallel and those 2 are parallel. So it's 2 pairs of parallel lines. And then all 4 angles are 90 degrees, meaning they're all congruent. So 4 angles, all 4 angles are congruent and 90 degrees. Note that if you look at the 2 definitions, the only difference between a square and a rectangle is that in a square, all 4 sides are the exact same, versus in a rectangle, these 2 are the same and those 2 are the same, but they're not all 4 the exact same. So for the next 13 shapes, you can find in the folder a filled out version of this with the tickings, but not with the definitions. So, because what I want is you need to practice looking at these markings and being able to write the definitions by yourself. So one of your grades is actually finishing this note catcher sheet and having it all filled out and then checking it to the key to make sure that you described your definitions correctly. So like I said, you can find a link that has all these filled out with the tick marks, but you need to go in and fill out all the definitions.